Lamb Lash is a comparative mythologist and shaman. He has devoted his life to bring the Gnostic teachings back to humanity after millennia of extermination and suppression. What was it about the knowledge of these intellectual shamans of the ancient world that it had to be completely destroyed?
It is so dangerous to the powers that be. It is so dangerous to the globalist overlords, to the technocrats, as we call them today. But if the story of the Aeons of Fire had been known, about our true origins, about the nature of evil, about the archons, none of that would have ever happened.
In this series of interviews, we will learn about the sacred mystery teachings of the ancient Gnostics and how it happened that we as a species have been torn out of our primal connection, our bond with Gaia, the living planet. We will also talk about the archontic, alien influence on the human mind that the Gnostics warned about, and how these ancient Gnostic warnings relate to the events of today and the agenda of transhumanism and technocracy. So, I've been wanting to do this interview for a long time, and finally it's an honor to welcome you, Lamb Lash.
Pleasure to be here.
So before we dive into all this, could you tell us a bit about your background? You grew up in a small American town of mostly Christians, and you came to devote your life to the sacred narrative of the Gnostics.
Well, I don't talk about my personal life often, but when I do, I find it to be a good opportunity to make a point, which is a point about the mystical and supernatural dimension of life. What life has taught me in my experiences is simply that mystical dimension, the supernatural, the power of the divine, is constantly here, right in front of us. In a sense, we don't have to go look for it. It comes to us and it finds us. So the reason why I'm here today talking to you is because from the age of 4, I had what some people would call paranormal experiences, particularly a lucid dream at the age of 4, which I consider to be the trigger point for my entire mystical quest in life. And when I bring that up, I always like to emphasize that I'm not unique in that respect. I believe that all children are in touch with the supernatural, the deeper beauty and power of the natural world. And all children have operating their psyche the inspiration and the guiding force and the love of our Divine Mother. She is always wanting to reach her children. So my adventure started with a lucid dream at the age of 4. I was born in New York City, but at the age of 3.5, my mother moved to a small fishing village in Maine. Many of you in Sweden would be able to picture it exactly beautifully, you know, the ledges, the pine woods, the magnificent sea. And I grew up in that paradise of a fishing village in a place called Friendship, Maine. And so fairly isolated, and yet the presence of nature really drew me. So I was constantly wandering in the woods, constantly wandering along the ledges and the coves and swimming, you know, and the winters were tremendous. We used to have 6-7 feet of snow, and I just adored it. I would go out into the snow for hours. It was like I was in a mystical trance in the presence of the snow. So I was that kind of child, you see. You say what we call like a nature boy. And then, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll come back to Christianity later. But so apparently, it was the Christianity that was surrounding you was not enough to really address these experiences that you had.
Well, the Christianity around me was intense. The town of Friendship is 900 people. About a third of them belong to the Lash family. I'm not actually of the Lash family. When I came to Friendship with my mother, I was born in New York. I was born Lamb, you know, so my name is John Lamb, but then I was adopted by my stepfather. That community and I didn't get along. We didn't get along. And so As I grew older, I became quite rebellious against the heavy indoctrination that they were placing on me. And obviously my hatred for Christianity traces back to that time. But again, at the age of 16, I had a tremendous hit of the supernatural, which was a Kundalini experience. And I suppose that many of your viewers will know what that is. It's like an electrical shock. You're hit by an electrical shock coming out of who knows where. And you feel this electrical cold electrical voltage going up your spine. It like pumps and it just goes into your head and it just explodes. Well, I had that spontaneously in 1961. So I was 15, 16 years old. And it went on for 6 months, not continuously, but during the night. I would go to sleep and then I would wake up in a lucid dream and then I would have this Kundalini experience, which was utterly terrifying to me. And it got more and more intense over a period of 6 months to the point where I thought, this is going to kill me. Because actually I was lying in my bed, just paralyzed by this force. And then in some miraculous way, bear in mind, I had no idea what this was. And there was nothing in my environment that could give me a clue, okay? I didn't even know what yogurt was, not to mention Kundalini yoga. And but in a beautiful and miraculous way, this event, which I perceived as some kind of attack on me, developed and ended in a very beautiful way, and I was released from it. But then I had an intense compulsion to figure out what happened to me, what was that about, and so that's when I took off. And I spent 2 or 3 years wandering in the East. I went to India, Japan, Southeast Asia. And little by little, I began to put together an idea of what it was that was trying to reach me. And it took many, many years to do that. I remember one big moment when the pieces came together. I had been traveling on a boat from Yokohama to Hong Kong. And on that boat, I met a very rich German who was traveling around the world. And he was very kind and friendly to me. And he was reading a book called The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. That book happened to have been published in the year I was born, 1945. So he said to me, yeah, would you like to take a look at this? Because I've finished reading it and we won't get to port for a few days. We just look at it. And I started to read this book. And I came to the chapter where Yogananda describes what he calls samadhi, which is an ecstatic trance of cosmic consciousness. And he talked about Kundalini in that book. And finally, I was like 19 then. So I realized what had happened to me and I got on that whole trail. So I have in the background of my mystical qualifications, if you will, okay, a strong component of the Eastern Asian factor. Hindu Tantra, Kundalini Yoga, Tao, Chan, Zen, all those things. I lived in Japan twice. I loved it. And then when I came back to the United States in 1967, I came right in on the tail of the psychedelic revolution. So that brings up LSD and other factors which we might bring into the conversation. And then I began to say, well, when I came back, I was very aware, look, I've had all these experiences in the Far East, some of which were insanely difficult. And yet I'm a man of the West. I'm a child of the West. I've got to understand I'm Irish Italian. I'm very attracted to Europe. I've got to understand my own tradition. I can't explain my life through the Asian, perspective. And that began a long series of studies, investigation that eventually led me to the Gnostic material. And that's where I found my calling.
So the fantastic achievement of your work is that you have restored the ancient mysteries to humanity, a narrative that could have been lost forever if it hadn't been for the Nag Hammadi codices that were discovered in Egypt. Could you tell us about those findings and the significance of them?
Certainly. In the first week of December 1945, which happens to be when I was born, curiously, isn't it? Yeah. A peasant was looking for manure in caves in a place north of Luxor called Hamrudun, near Nag Hammadi. And he found in clay jars these texts, which are called the Nag Hammadi codices. Codice means a book. And they are, in fact, the oldest surviving example of bound books. They are written on papyrus in Coptic, and the papyrus leaves are cut. They're very small. Imagine the size of a woman's hand purse. And they're bound together. So he found these books. And then it wasn't till the next year, 1947, that a scholar from France, Jean Dorès, was in Cairo. He visited the museum of the man who had bought these from the Arab peasant. And he looked at them and he said, wow, do you realize what this is? And then the whole story unfolded. And it got to be, that was 46, it got to be around 30 years later in 76 that they brought out an English translation, which is called the Nag Hammadi Library in English, which is very difficult to read and largely incomprehensible. So to cut to the chase, this discovery brought back to the world a story. And that story had almost entirely been eliminated by the destruction of the mystery schools, the murder of the initiates, like Hypatia, by the burning of countless numbers of scrolls and documents, not just the Alexandria Library, but many others. So there was a centuries-long attempt at cultural and intellectual genocide with the purpose that nobody knows the story. We don't want anyone to hear this story because there's something extremely threatening about the story of the goddess Sophia, the wisdom goddess. So I was able to restore this story and update it and bring it into the world today. And my book, Not in His Image, was the first book that ever presented in published form the restoration of this myth.
I remember one of the first interviews I heard with you. As a journalist, you're always curious to find classified material, and you know that the people of power always try to hide the most important stuff. And you said that this narrative really is the most suppressed information in human history. Why is that?
It is so dangerous to the powers that be. It is so dangerous to the globalist overlords, to the technocrats, as we call them today. And one of the things I set out to do in Not in His Image, and apparently I succeeded, according to the response that I've gotten over the years, had two purposes. I not only wanted to explain the problem, the basic problem of evil on this planet, which can only be explained in the Gnostic perspective, in my view. And second, I wanted to present the solution to that problem. So the first part of Not in His Image, the first part of the book in 6 chapters, explains the problem of evil. And everything traces back to a cult. Today, when you look at the WEF and Klaus Schwab, when you look at what's happening with the COVID agenda, any intelligent person using common sense can see, well, wait a minute, we're fighting against a cult, an elite, it's often called. The globalist elite is just a cult. And this cult of technocracy, the supremacy of AI, and racial supremacy all goes back to one particular root, which is this hidden cult that appeared in Judaism about 1800 BC. So that is the movement that now dominates the world today. That cult has taken many centuries to gain the power that it has. But if the story of the Aeon Sophia had been known about our true origins, about the nature of evil, about the archons and AI, none of that would have ever happened. So they had to eliminate the competition. That's why it's been defamed, repressed. And even today, I must add this is really important. You know, there's a lot of talk about Gnosticism on the internet. And if you go to like Gaia.com, you'll find people talking about it. One of those people is my former colleague, Graham Hancock. And they present, Graham and others present a version of Gnosticism, which is not correct. And so I consider them to be controlled opposition, either due to ignorance or intention or both. I don't know. But I would love to be on a stage with them, to debate with them. I want people who are listening now to know that you might have heard talks about Gnosticism from many different people on the internet, but you haven't heard both sides of the story. There are two versions of it.
So let's talk about the Gnostics. Who were they?
Well, they were essentially intellectuals. They were intellectual shamans. I'm an intellectual shaman. So you have shamans in the Amazonian jungle, in Peru. You have shamans in Siberia. Shamanism is all over the world. They represented a specific class of intellectual shamans. And so they were also the teachers and educators of the ancient world. They founded the mystery schools. Now, the mystery schools were not only centers of initiation where they themselves pursued their own cultic activities, but they were universities of learning, you see? So they founded the traditions of learning. They taught literacy, they introduced alphabets, they taught all the arts and sciences, they taught astronomy, everything you can name of. But that group, called the Gnostics, is generally identified with a movement around the time that Christianity arose. This is misleading. The movement of Gnosticism far predated Christianity. So I trace them back to what I call the Magian order. And it's related to the word magus or magi, So the biblical fairy tale says the three magi came to the Christ child. So who were the Magians? Well, they were actually the originators of all later Gnosticism. They were actually the great forefathers of the mystery schools. And they came out of the Caucasus Mountains. And they were an elite group of Aryan Caucasians. Their race is very important. And they were Persians. And Persians are not Arabs, even today. Persia, Iran, is not Arabic, although it is operates under Islam because it was conquered by Islam. Ancestrally, the people of Iran are Persians, which is white Caucasian people. And that was the racial group that brought the story of Sophia to the world. And they were the founders of the mysteries. And then over many centuries, they expanded the mystery school system into a vast network. So they had schools all around the Mediterranean basin, in Eleusis, in Egypt, in Syria. And they were both men and women were the spiritual guides, if you want to use an easy term, of the people of pre-Christian antiquity.
So before we go into the mysteries and Aeon Sophia, some people don't have any prior knowledge. So I just want to begin with the very basics of reality, really. If you read the Judeo-Christian religion or even mainstream science, it's always talk about creation, the creator God or Big Bang creation. In your words, in your book, you use the word emanation. Could you explain the difference?
Yeah, there's a huge difference. In fact, when you look at Gnostic cosmology and the science of Gnosticism, which is actually noetics, is actually the real term for it. Cognitive psychology, noetics. That is to say, the science of knowing how the human mind works, how your psyche is constructed, and how the operations of your psyche are interactive with nature. This is the foundation of it. When you look into that, you have the opportunity to see an entirely different creation scenario. Now, the Abrahamic religions teach that there is an off-planet Father God, whatever you want, name him, Jehovah. Well, where is he? Can I smell him, touch him, taste him? Can I see him? No, I have to believe in him because he's not really present in a tangible way. He's off-planet in some other dimension. And they believe that deity created the world in the way that a potter creates a pot. Well, what you learn in Gnosticism is that is completely wrong, completely not the way to see it. So Gnosticism draws upon actually a theory, paradigm, that became very popular quite a while ago called chaos theory or chaos physics. It's now called complexity theory. Now, this is a huge branch of study, but it is an alternative science. It's not mainstream science. And according to this theory, the correct concept for everything that is happening, like what is happening right now, is that it is emergent. It was never actually created in an act that was then done and finished, and we are living in the created result, in the product of that creation? No. We're not living in the product of any creation at all. We're living in an ongoing, emergent creation. And the metaphor that I use for that is dreaming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you compare also that the Gnostics have a lot in common with other indigenous traditions. The Gnostics are really the indigenous Europeans. I want to quote from your book where you compare the dream time, the Aborigines in Australia. You write, everything that happens in the dream time in cosmic and mythical terms also occurs in the psyche and in surrounding nature. Can you explain?
Yes. That means that, well, let me go directly to the source. How do I know what I'm talking about? And how did the Gnostics know it? Well, I studied what the Gnostics did and wrote, and I inferred from that, it looks like they had this particular experience of reality. Well, can I have that experience myself? And then I went into the shamanic experiment, to see if I could verify it by my own experience. And I did. And I'll tell you what the verification looks like. I'll give you a concrete example. I was sitting at once in a lovely restaurant on the coast of Spain, near a town called Estepona. And I was sitting there with a friend who deeply knows planetary tantra, so we were talking our cultic jargon, you know what I mean? And so sitting in this wonderful patio, looking out at the Mediterranean, looking out at the sea, and the waves are coming in gently. It was at twilight. And I said to her, the natural state that you are in, which is the state of animism, which is the state of all indigenous peoples, is like a trance-like or dream-like state. And when you're in that state, you see things differently. For instance, we look now, here's the beach, the waves coming in. There's some gulls flying in a pattern across the sky. And when you are in that trance-like state, all of that is happening immediately to you. It is as if it is being painted right in front of your eyes. It's as if you stood by an artist in front of a canvas and the artist is painting. It is being painted and emanated at the moment that you see it. Nothing is finished. It has the nature of an emergent reality, of an ongoing dream. And you are in that dream, but you are awake in that dream. So that is the way that I verified for myself what the Gnostics experience, which is expressed in that quote. It's so beautiful when you realize that, your psyche, which you call your psyche, what is that? Well, I've got my imagination, my memories, my emotions, my moods. Okay, I'm feeling kind of sullen, or I'm feeling kind of comical, whatever mood you're in. I'm feeling desperate, or I'm feeling elated, and then you look out at the world and you're perceiving the world. That's an aspect of your psyche. So all the factors in your psyche, perception, memory, imagination, are actually not happening in an isolated way. They are, in fact, acts of nature, just as much as the budding of leaves of a tree or a gull flying across the sky. And when you can experience that and immerse yourself in that, there is a bliss and there is a depth. And that depth is where you find your encounter with the Earth Mother herself. You know that she is dreaming your reality at every moment, and you don't have a life outside her dream. You can pretend you do. In fact, she allows you to do. She allows you to go on as if your life were just your own. But it isn't. Not at any moment. It is an active part of her dreaming power. And the experience of that is the basis of Gnosis today.
So now it's a good moment to talk about the ancient mysteries. You said, I think, in one of your talks that it's a little bit like if you have a role to play in a movie and you're not sure exactly what you're supposed to do, and you get to sit down for a while with the script writer. Can you tell us a little bit about the ancient mysteries, how much we know about it, and what it was all about?
Well, basically, the fundamental thing you need to realize is that they had this story, they had this narrative, the fallen goddess scenario, which I restored. And then, so what? So what? Well, how is it different than any other myth? How is it different than the myth of Genesis in the Bible, or the myth of the Navajo people about creation, or the myth that comes from the Greeks and the Romans? Well, it is very different, very, because it is a participatory myth. So once they had the narrative, they know the whole story of our Earth Mother from the moment that she came out of the galactic core and turned into the Earth. And so once they had the story, it took many generations to develop it. They were like screenwriters that, it's like Superman 1, 2, 3, 4, Spider-Man 1, 2, 3, 4. They kept iterating it and developing it. Once they had developed it, for thousands of years, really, they said, well, now we get to the interesting part. The myth says that human animals on the Earth, along with all the other animal species, live in this habitat, which is actually the body of Sophia. And yet, the myth says that the human genome was her special project, which is called the anthropos. So in Gnostic teaching, the Greek word anthropos means the human genome. So she designed the human genome. And I could tell you in great detail how she did it and what the factors in the human genome is. So she designs the human genome, and then it turns out that the human animal emerges in this habitat, which we know, and it's an experiment. She set up an experiment. We are the primary subject of this experiment. So what I'm telling you now, I can tell you in words in 5 minutes. But you need to appreciate that it took centuries for the Gnostics to distill what I'm telling you now, because it is extremely fucking sophisticated. It really is. And so they were able to ask questions. They were able to say, well, if the human being was designed in the galactic center, that's what the narrative says, and then the plasm of the human genome, which is a nucleic acid-based plasm, your genomic identity is a nucleic acid plasm, was spread and grew and emerged on the earth, well, what's the point? What did she want? Why did she want the human beings to be in a laboratory setting? And what was the purpose of this experiment? Say, what is the purpose of this experiment? Why are we here? And they went deeply into that question. And basically what they came up with was, well, we're here and we are different than other species, though we're not so superior, you know. I mean, in my personal opinion, a lot of other animals are much, you know, better than us in certain ways. They certainly can't perpetrate evil on the scale that we can. But why are we here? Well, we're here to see if we can discover and express those talents that she gave to us when she designed the human genome. So she's watching, and the other aeons of the Galactic Center are all watching this experiment which we're in. It's a live experiment. And they want to see, basically, it's very simple. Will that animal, the anthropine species, be able, by its mental and emotional faculties, to know itself and to see what we have given it as talents and skills? And then how will they develop these, and how will they interact with each other? Because those talents and skills are distributed in the different races in different proportions.
So you have put together, this is a fantastic story you have put together on the basis of the Nag Hammadi library. It's called The Fallen Goddess Scenario, and I encourage everyone to watch. It's on YouTube. It's about 3.5 hours. And this should be really a separate program to dive into it. But is it possible to sort of summarize the main features?
I'll summarize it, yeah. It's always a challenge to summarize it because it is a vast and elaborate myth. Don't ever think it isn't. It's complex and elaborate. Basically, first thing I would say about it is it's beautiful. The most beautiful story on earth is the story about the earth. So it explains the origin of the earth. And an important factor to understand is that Sophia, or Gaia Sophia, Gaia, same Sophia, is not just a name. It's not just like, well, a dog shows up in my life, a stray dog I meet in the park, and I take it home, and I decide to call her Lulu. So the dog existed before I called her Lulu, right? Likewise, Sophia existed before we called her Gaia. So when you look at the earth now, the living habitat of nature, and you say, yeah, that's Gaia, that's my planetary mother, you don't think that's just a name you're giving to her since she became the earth. She had that name before. So the first thing that the story, the narrative tells is that how she got to be the earth. It describes where she originated, which is in the galactic center. So the Sophianic myth is not just about anywhere, any place, any time. It's not just about the universe. It's about this galaxy. It's an astronomical myth about things that happened in this galaxy. And so, as the story goes, there she was in the galactic core. Now, there's a difference between the galactic core, which is called a pleroma, and the galactic arms, which is called a kenoma. And this distinction is very clear in the cosmology. So you can think of the pleroma, or the core of the galaxy, as an observation booth. So there are these scientists and artists in this observation booth, and they dream up experiments with species. They actually invent species. Gods invent species. And then they say, well, we'd like to see how this species performs. So what are we going to do? What they do then is they project it out of the central core in the form of a germ plasm that is carried on filaments, plasmic filaments. And these filaments carry it out into the galactic arms. And it floats through the galactic arms like seeds floating on the stream of a river. But occasionally, those seeds drop into a planet. When they find a planet that's an environment that attracts them, they drop into it. See, all life comes from outer space.
So they were conducting these experiments with the human genome, and in this particular case, this Aeon Sophia, which was called the wisdom goddess, she became so how do you say, engaged and fascinated with this experiment that she got carried away outside this observation booth and plunged into that's how I understand it. Is it correct?
That is exactly correct. So let me elaborate a little. So they saw these 9 experiments. Bear in mind, this is experiments with human animals, just like you and me, that have already happened in remote time. And they found out that, that it was problematical. There was something about this species that, like, wow, it just went off the rails. It just turned against its own environment. And in some sense, which needs to be carefully considered, these 9 previous experiments collapsed. Now, Sophia was she was deeply troubled about this, because she was the mother of the species. She gave it its genomic capacities. So every time they watched one of these, she became more and more concerned. And her concern was so strong that if you picture her, you picture a group of scientists in a science fiction movie inside an observation booth. Remember, they are not reaching out into the experiment. You know, in some biological laboratories and in some experiments, you see scientists in booth with gloves. They insert that and they handle the material with the gloves, right? They don't do that. Normally, according to their protocols, and they do have protocols, they don't interfere. But imagine her drawing away from the other aeons in the pleroma and like putting her face right up to the observation booth and like looking down in astonishment. What's happening with my designer species? How can this be? And her passion for that species, for the next experiment, the 10th, was so powerful that she actually left the pleroma. She plunged. That is the core meaning of the fallen goddess. She plunged into the galactic arms because she was so drawn to what was going to happen to the human species that she broke the boundary. She transgressed the boundary. And this is called the fall of the wisdom goddess.
And her body is really the setting of this, became the setting. She morphed into the planet Earth.
Now she did, but before she did, she went through some changes, man. She went through tremendous dramas, which are all described in those 9 episodes. So that is the narrative. I can't emphasize how much I love it, obviously, and how unique it is. You won't hear this story anywhere else. And one of the features of the story is that it explains the origin of what we call evil.
Yeah. So I was thinking to return to how she, by mistake, really created the archons. But I just wanted to say first that some people listening to this, they might say, okay, it's a goddess and it's this and that. It's just another religion. But you explain, I think, very well in your book that this is an alternative to all religions, really in the sense that most religions always have a lot of middlemen, don't they? It's the Son of God, and then there's a preacher man telling you, this is about personal experience that everyone can have. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah, it's Gnosis. It's Gnosis. Religion is faith. It's based on belief. What I'm telling you is not based on belief. In fact, don't believe me. don't believe me. The only way to approach the Gnostic message is to test it out for yourself and find out. So there's a practice for testing it. So it becomes your first-hand experience, you see? So yeah, the other thing about that distinguishes this Sophianic way of life from religion is that there is no authoritarian doctrine. There are no rules coming down from the Father God of how you should behave. There is no hierarchy. There is no church as such, and there is no salvation, and there is no Messiah. All of those things, the sacrifice of the Savior, the power of the omniscient power of the Father God, completely absent from this narrative, completely.
When you describe the mysteries, it is a ceremony which you have also developed in your own life, which you call planetary tantra, where this Aeon Sophia, although when I go out in nature, I see trees and rivers. If I go into a trance, a sort of trance state, I can experience her as you call it the organic light. I really encourage everyone to go on YouTube to find the Gnostic biography of our planet, which is called The Fallen Goddess Scenario, which is 3.5 hours. And so we're going to return to this story again when we talk about the origin of the archons. But why don't you tell us the part where this divine intelligence, Sophia, actually morphs into our planet?
Happily. The fallen goddess scenario is an astronomical myth. But when I say it's a myth, that doesn't mean it's a superstitious fiction or a fantasy. You know, a myth is just a narrative. But in particular, a myth is a narrative that talks about power, origins, and goes right to the root of human reality. So no myth is a genuine myth unless it says something about power and the power that brings us here now. Well, one of the things I've often said about the fallen goddess scenario is that since I recovered it and restored it, it has been confirmed by science in many ways. It's not confirmed by the accepted paradigm of science, which is there was a Big Bang, and then there was then there were planetary formations in this way, you know, a totally materialistic view. No, it's more confirmed by what is called electric universe or plasma cosmology, which is a renegade branch of science that is growing greatly. Their channel is Thunderbolts Project. So on their channel and elsewhere on the internet, you can find photos, if you can call them that, of what are called plasma ejections. And what these photos actually show, whether they be CGI, I don't know exactly what they're based on, but they show the galactic disk. So you have the core of the galaxy, which is white, pure, and then you have the galactic arms. And they show a plume-like eruption out of the galactic center. This is known. It's now legitimate on scientific terms. That is exactly what happened to the Aeon Sophia. She erupted like a plume of pure white plasma from the galactic center. This is what the scenario describes. But the unique thing about her eruption, and this is so important, is that it was not a vertical eruption. So you have the galactic disk, the lenticular spiral, and you have a vertical eruption. No, it was a lateral eruption. So it went out from the galactic center across the galactic arms and literally crashed into a particular place in the galactic arms, which is where we are now, which is the third arm from the center, close to the area of the constellation of Orion. And that is the exact astronomical description of what the myth tells us about her.
So this very part of the fallen goddess scenario, where she actually morphs into the planet, and as I understand it, she sort of dreams up what we call nature. Can you talk about that part?
Yeah, one of the brilliant and outstanding points of Gnostic cosmology is that it is not a creationist paradigm. The Aeon Sophia did not create the earth. She turned into the earth. So this is called rather an emanationist theory, an emanationist cosmology. And so Gnostics today consider that this earth, the environment of nature, is actually a projection of her dreaming. And the body of the planet itself, no matter what shape you may give to it, is comparable to what you have when you dream. It's a dream body. So she is literally dreaming everything in nature. She's dreaming the flowering of the trees, the seasons, the tides. And we are a subject, a special subject in the laboratory that she is dreaming.
So, according to the Gnostics, the purpose of human existence is to co-evolve consciously with the planetary intelligence. Is this common to all indigenous people?
Yes and no. All indigenous peoples were, by default, animistic. So animism is not a theory, the theory that all of nature is alive. It's a reality. And that is the default setting of all animistic peoples, all previous tribes and cultures. And the evidence of that, of course, is enormous, So the Gnostic story takes it one step further. You see, in indigenous cultures around the world, which survive today merely in a decimated form, those people still know that nature is alive. They know that they are in the presence of a supernatural power, which they call, say, Wakantanka. They have various names for it. It's called Wakantanka in the Lakota Sioux. And yet, they do not have an intellectually involved relationship to it. So Gnosis is the intellectually involved relationship to the presence of the living planet, and it is a practice of interactivity with the Mother Goddess, co-creation.
There was an American scholar called Jack Forbes, a Native American, and he said that most tribes didn't have a word for religion. And then he added that that's a word you probably only use when you have lost it. So the Gnostic teachings is not a religion in the terms of believing something or following certain rules. It's about having the experience of interacting with this planetary intelligence. And these ceremonies of initiation in the antique were called the mysteries. You refer to this encounter as the encounter with the organic light. Right, can you explain?
Sure, it's really simple. And this is the ultimate secret of the mysteries. Now, in the mysteries of the pagan world, pre-Christian antiquity, they had a rule. And the rule was that they would not talk outwardly or publicly about what I'm going to tell you now. So by their intimate connection with the earth and the intelligence of the earth, and by their special method of trance, they went into trance. And in this trance, you go into a deep, deep learning process. They recognized two facts. One fact was that the plasmatic eruption from the galactic center actually turned into the earth. The wisdom goddess turned into the earth. But the second fact they realized was that even though she turned into the earth, even though she is present to you in the clouds, the sky, the rivers, she also retains her original status. And that original status is a living, luminous, plasmatic torrent. She is a torrent of plasmatic light. And they were actually able to encounter that light. So it's as if you could say, and I think this is a great analogy and doesn't need anything more. When you see nature, you see the goddess in her garment, in her clothing, but you can also see her naked. And when you see her naked, you encounter a light, the organic light. And this is what they did. And we can do this today. I've done it many times, and others have done it as well.
So this has nothing to do with religion in the sense that most people use it, like in the Christianity, for instance.
It has nothing to do with religion, dogma, authority, hierarchy, structure. The fundamental experience of everyone in Gnosis today is the same. It's not the same because it's dictated to be the same. It's the same because everyone who encounters the organic light has the same experience. That being so, there is no need for religion. There is no need to construct a dogma around it. In fact, it's the last thing that anyone would want to do. Everyone, not everyone, but those who have the disposition and the reverence to meet the organic light have no feeling of religion whatsoever. As I've said before, Gnosis is not an alternative religion. It is an alternative to all religions. We don't need religion.
So that's why I think your book is so incredibly important. And it's important to understand that this connection with the intelligence of the earth had to be destroyed in order for tyranny to take hold of this planet. I want to quote from your book. In the history of the human race, no campaign of spiritual, cultural, and intellectual genocide compares to what was launched against the guardians of the mysteries. And so this is so important because most people don't know this. Talk about the enormity of this destructive and genocidal assault through the centuries, really, and through the continents.
Certainly. I would say that certain things are innate to what I call the human animal. I prefer to say that than the human being. And certain tendencies and needs are inert to the human animal, just as they are to a wolf, to a butterfly. We have our instinctual needs. And actually, what people call the religious connection or the need to relate to God is a genuine and true instinct. But because that instinct is so deep and so powerful, if someone were to seize upon it and redirect it somewhere else, the results would be absolutely disastrous. And this is what happened in the early centuries of the Christian era. There was a huge power struggle. And so the Christian ideologues coming from the Judaic background, because Christianity is nothing but Judaism, by the way, in case you don't know that, you're ignorant. Coming from that background, there was an attempt to say, we're going to seize upon this natural, beautiful instinct of the human animal, and we're going to redirect it, we're going to co-opt it and redirect it into our religious program. And that's what they did. And the way that they did that was not by persuasion and argument, not by standing in public and arguing debating with the Gnostics, because they would never have lasted 8 minutes in debating with the Gnostic, but by suppression, burning of their libraries, demonization of them, the whole demonization of so-called pagan spirituality, which everyone's listening knows about, goes back to a long, long program of 2,000 years in order to corrupt that program and to direct people away from the immediate reverence and beauty you feel in the presence of nature into a spiritual or religious program. My book starts, chapter 1, as you know, with the murder of Hypatia. That is one of the most well-known stories from the ancient world, and there are 6 or 7 versions of it. 2 of them are first-hand versions. And the murder of Hypatia, who was a teacher at Alexandria, a teacher of mathematics in the mystery schools, exemplifies the incredible violence that was directed against the people who had this connection to the goddess. Because unless that connection was destroyed, none of the Judeo-Christian Islamic religious programming today could even exist.
And that's also important to emphasize that it didn't end there. It continued, as you said, with the genocidal campaigns in the New World and in Australia. And as I understand you correctly, also the so-called witch hunt was also part of this.
Absolutely. First of all, they wiped out the mysteries. They destroyed the sanctuaries. They burned the libraries. They murdered the initiates or sent them into exile, and that wasn't nearly enough. It went on for centuries after that. You could be burned alive for having a Gnostic book in your possession. And then it carried on. Once they had basically eliminated the system of the mystery schools, which was a network all around Europe, extending into Scotland and all around the Mediterranean basin, they said, well, no, that's not good enough, because the indigenous people of Europe, in Germany, France, British Isles, Spain, still are holding on to this goddess figure. And so now we're going to go after the witches and the warlocks and any woman who, midwives, and any woman who heals with the herbs of nature. We're going to take them out too, because the risk is too great that even if one shred of this connection remains, we will not achieve our program.
So it's really about a war against nature itself and against our connection with nature. And in order to understand the hatred toward life on this planet, and also to understand the ongoing today transhumanist agenda, one has to learn about the archons, the alien mindset that the Gnostics warned about. But before we go there, could you explain the anti-life components that are present in Judeo-Christian religion, the Redeemer complex, as you call it?
Yeah, certainly. There are various approaches to take to that question. But to go to the heart of it, which I'd like to do, I would say this. The Gnostics claimed that they knew the solution to the problem of evil. And that was one of the main reasons why they were hated by the Judeo-Christian ideologues, the Christian fathers and all that. It really threatened them. It really threatened them that somebody came out on the stage and said, hey, wait, we know what the origin of evil is. Now, fast forward to today, many sincere people who are struggling and suffering with this covert deception, which is the end game of the archons, by the way, are asking themselves the question, how can anyone be so evil? How can anyone be so deceitful? How can anyone, we're all human beings, right? Of one ethnic brand or another. How can anyone be so evil, so, I use the phrase, insane and inhumane, as to try to, pull off this crime? And the answer is, you can't know the answer unless you include a paranormal factor. So when you look at human beings left to their own, without if the archonic intrusion hadn't happened, and we might get back to how that happened and how the archons were created. If you look at that and you say, okay, here are human beings from different countries, different lands, different continents, different races, and sure, they're going to have differences. They're going to maybe have wars with each other, but they're also going to cooperate with each other and mix and trade and have amiable relationships. And if you just look at all of that the interactions of all the races on their own, you won't find evil as we see it in the world today, because evil comes in through a third factor,